What in God's name is that mess? His voice boomed across the pier, heavy and sharp like rusted metal. Big Sal, the dockmaster, jabbed a thick finger at my work. That looks like a joke. A cat's cradle a child would make. The salty air of Gloucester Harbor suddenly felt suffocating. I could hear the gentle lapping of waves, but it was drowned out by the snickers of the other dockhands. Sal stood over me, his shadow swallowing me whole, a man whose authority was measured in decibels. The shame was a hot poker in my gut as he made a public spectacle of my grandfather's knot. He saw it as an insult to his modern, by-the-book world. But I saw something else, a strange bruised color on the horizon that the weather reports had ignored. I made a choice to trust the old ways. But nobody imagined what I would do that day. If this sentence reminded you of someone, just comment with, "I understand." My name is Riley and I'm 40 years old. For every single one of those years, the Gloucester Harbor has been my world. It's more than a place of work. It's in my blood, a salty inheritance passed down from my grandfather. My hands tell the story of my life better than my words ever could. They're a roadmap of calluses, scars from slipped fishing knives, and skin permanently weathered by sun and brine. I'm not a man of many words. I prefer to listen to the creak of the docks, the cry of the gulls, the deep, ancient language of the tides. In a place filled with loud voices and bigger egos, being quiet makes you invisible, or worse, it makes you a target. My target had a name, Big Sal. He was the dockmaster, a man whose presence was like a sudden squall. He was built like an old oil drum, solid and unmovable, and his voice had the same grating roar as a rusty winch. Sal believed in two things, the weather forecast on the radio and the sound of his own authority. Anything else, especially the quiet wisdom of the old ways, he considered garbage, and he considered me the living embodiment of that garbage. He never missed a chance to remind me, and everyone else within earshot, of that fact. It wasn't just that I was quiet, it was everything about me. The way I dressed in my grandfather's patched-up coat, the way I took my time to check the lines, the way I saw the harbor not as a machine to be managed, but as a living thing to be respected. To Sal, I was a relic, a ghost of a bygone era that was inefficient and weak. I remember one morning last spring, the sun was just beginning to burn the fog off the water. A charter boat, the Tidal King, was getting ready to take a group of wealthy tourists out for the day. Sal was standing there, arms crossed, overseeing everything like a Roman emperor. He watched me coil a rope, my movements slow and deliberate, the way my grandfather taught me, ensuring it wouldn't kink or tangle. Sal strode over and kicked the perfectly coiled rope, sending it sprawling across the wet planks. "What is this, Riley? You weaving a basket for your grandma?" he boomed. The tourist chuckled. The other dockhands smirked and looked away, not wanting to get caught in his storm. "We're on a schedule here, not your nap time. Coil it fast and coil it right. My way." His way was a quick, sloppy loop that would tangle the second you needed it in a hurry. He made me redo it 3 times, right there in front of everyone, each attempt earning a new insult, until the coil was a messy, inefficient pile that satisfied his need for dominance. I just kept my head down, my face burning with a familiar hot shame. The worst part wasn't the yelling, it was the silence of everyone else. It was the feeling of being utterly alone, a joke that everyone was in on but me. But the moment that truly carved itself into my memory happened with the sea serpent. She was a magnificent vessel, a newly restored wooden schooner, her varnish gleaming like honey in the sun. Her owner, a man whose suit probably cost more than my truck, was watching from the deck. The pressure was on. I was tasked with securing her primary mooring lines. I finished the job with the knot my grandfather swore by, a complex series of loops and hitches he called the Gloucester Twist. It was his masterpiece, a knot that used a ship's own tension against itself, tightening under strain instead of slipping. It took maybe 10 seconds longer to tie than a standard bowline, and in Sal's world, 10 seconds was an eternity of disrespect. He came lumbering down the pier, his heavy boots thudding a rhythm of impending doom. "What in God's name is that mess?" His voice cut through the air, and all activity on the dock seemed to stop. He jabbed a thick, sausage-like finger at my work. "That looks like a joke, a cat's cradle a child would make." He looked up at the schooner's owner and then back at me, a cruel smirk on his face. "You're wasting time with that old garbage. Tie a proper bowline like a real dockhand." The shame was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I could feel the eyes of the other workers on my back, their pity and amusement mingling in the salty air. "It'll hold," I managed to say, my voice a dry whisper. Sal let out a laugh that was more of a bark. "It'll hold us all back is what it'll do." He spat, his spittle landing near my boots. "Get it done right." He turned and walked away, leaving me in the echo of his derision. I didn't change the knot. It was a silent act of defiance, a tribute to the only man who had ever made me feel like I wasn't worthless. That afternoon, the day began to turn. It started as something small, something nobody else noticed. The air, which had been clear and bright, took on a strange, heavy stillness. The usual playful chatter of the gulls by the fish cleaning station went silent. Then I saw them, hundreds of them, flying inland in a tight, determined formation. That's not something you see on a calm day. I looked out at the horizon. The official forecast on the radio in Sal's office was calling for light showers, nothing more. But the sky to the northeast wasn't the color of rain. It was a deep, bruised purple, a shade I'd only seen once before, years ago, right before a storm that snapped a pier in half. The water in the harbor began to change too. The gentle lapping of the waves was replaced by a low, deep swell, as if some giant beast was breathing just beneath the surface. I walked over to Sal's office. He was on the phone, laughing about something. I waited, and when he hung up, I said, "Sal, we should double the lines. There's a big blow coming." He didn't even look at me. He just waved a dismissive hand. "Riley, the radio says showers." "Are you listening to the birds again? Leave the thinking to the people who know what they're doing." One of the younger guys snickered. "He's probably got a feeling in his trick knee." The dismissal was absolute. My experience, my instincts, everything my grandfather had taught me to observe, was rendered meaningless by a voice on the radio and a man who refused to see past his own arrogance. But I knew they were wrong. The sea was talking, and I was the only one listening. I couldn't force them to act, but I could do what I always did. I went back to my work, my eyes fixed on that bruised horizon, and I began to prepare in my own quiet way. If you've ever felt this way, like you're the only one seeing the truth while everyone else is laughing, just leave in the comments. We get it. I walked away from Sal's office, but his laughter followed me, echoing off the water. "Listening to the birds again," he'd said. The words were meant to sting, to shrink me down to nothing. And for a moment they did. A cold knot of doubt tightened in my stomach. What if I was wrong? What if this was just another gray afternoon on the coast, and I was turning it into a drama in my own head? I could almost hear the other guys telling the story later over beers. "You should have seen old Riley today, running around like a chicken with its head cut off because he saw a few clouds." The shame of that possibility was almost as bad as the fear of the storm itself. But then I felt the wind shift. It wasn't a strong gust, just a slight cold breath on the back of my neck, carrying a scent that didn't belong here. It was the smell of deep water, of rain that hadn't touched land in 1,000 miles. It was the smell of power, and it was the same smell I remembered from the night my grandfather's boat never came home. That memory cut through the doubt like a sharpened knife. I wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. Sal had given his order, no extra work, but he hadn't told me I couldn't check my own. I started walking the pier, my eyes scanning every line, every cleat. My hands, numb with a strange mix of cold and adrenaline, moved with a memory of their own. I went back to the Sea Serpent. The schooner was a thing of beauty, her wooden hull gleaming even under the darkening sky. She felt alive and she felt vulnerable. My Gloucester twist was holding her fast, but one line wasn't enough for what I felt was coming. I grabbed a spare length of 3-strand nylon, thick as my wrist. My hands were shaking now, not from fear of the storm, but from the act of defiance. Every wrap of the rope around the piling was a direct contradiction to Sal's command. I could feel his eyes on me from his office window, a burning point of pressure on my back. I didn't look. I just focused on the rope in my hands. I tied a second knot, a variation of the first, cinching it down until my knuckles were white. The rope groaned in protest, biting into the wood. Let them watch. Let them all watch. The other dockhands saw what I was doing. A couple of them, the younger ones, smirked and shook their heads. But a few of the older guys, men who had been here as long as I had, they just watched with a quiet, unreadable expression. They knew the signs too. They'd seen skies like this before. But they were also men who knew how to keep their jobs. They stayed quiet, their loyalty torn between the dockmaster's paycheck and the sea's ancient warnings. I felt utterly alone, a man on a tiny island of his own making, surrounded by a sea of doubt. The wind was getting stronger now, moaning as it whipped through the rigging of the sailboats, turning the masts into a strange, discordant orchestra. The water in the harbor had turned from a deep green to a churning, slate-gray monster, spitting white foam onto the planks. The boats were no longer rocking gently. They were bucking and pulling at their lines like panicked animals. The air grew thick and heavy, so dense you could almost taste the electricity in it. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Then the sky broke open. It wasn't rain. It was a solid wall of water, hitting the pier with the force of a fire hose. The wind didn't howl anymore. It screamed, a high-pitched physical shriek that vibrated in my bones. The first real gust hit like a physical punch, staggering me sideways. I grabbed onto a piling to keep from being blown into the raging water. Chaos erupted. Shouts were ripped from men's mouths and swallowed by the storm. Lights flickered and died, plunging the docks into a terrifying twilight, lit only by strobes of lightning that revealed scenes of pure pandemonium. Then came the sound I had been dreading. It was a sharp crack, like a gunshot, followed by a sickening crunch of fiberglass. A fishing boat, the Lucky Lady, had broken her bowline. The rope hadn't just untied, it had snapped clean through. Freed from her tether, she was slammed into the boat next to her again and again by the relentless waves. Another crack echoed across the water as a wooden cleat ripped right out of the pier, taking chunks of splintered wood with it. Sal's approved knots, the fast and efficient bowlines, were failing one by one. They were slipping and snapping under the violent, unpredictable strain. The harbor was turning into a demolition derby. I saw Sal come out of his office, his face a pale mask of disbelief. He was yelling, pointing, but his voice was a joke against the roar of the storm. His authority, once as solid as the concrete pilings, had vanished into the wind. He was just another scared man, powerless against something he had refused to believe in. My world narrowed to the Sea Serpent. She was being brutalized, lifted by monstrous swells and then dropped with a force that should have torn her apart. The waves crashed over her bow, sending explosions of white water across her polished deck. She strained against my lines, the wood of her hull groaning in protest. I could see the ropes, my ropes, stretched so taut they looked like bars of steel. The fibers were screaming under the tension. I watched, my heart pounding against my ribs, waiting for the snap. I saw my grandfather's knot, the cat's cradle, the joke. And with every wave that tried to tear the schooner free, the knot did exactly what he said it would. It didn't slip. It didn't stretch. It bit down harder, cinching tighter with every violent jerk, using the storm's own fury to strengthen its grip. That old piece of garbage, that relic from a forgotten time, was holding. While everything else was breaking, my grandfather's wisdom was holding. That's when everything changed, and no one ever looked at me the same way again. Would you have done the same? Seriously, just answer with yes or no, so I know you're here. The wind was a physical being, a monster made of sound and fury. And in the middle of its tantrum, the sea serpent held. It was a surreal sight. All around us, the harbor was a scene of pure carnage. Boats worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were being smashed into each other like cheap toys. Lines snapped with reports like rifle fire. Men were screaming, their voices instantly erased by the gale. And through it all, that beautiful wooden schooner, held fast by a knot that had been an object of ridicule just hours before, rode the violent waves with a strange, defiant grace. I saw Sal, standing in the doorway of his office, drenched and useless. His face, illuminated by the strobing emergency lights, was a canvas of disbelief. The man who ruled this pier with an iron will and a booming voice was silent. He was watching the same thing I was. He was watching my grandfather's knot hold. But the storm wasn't done with us. A new sound cut through the chaos, a high-pitched screech of tearing metal. The Northern Star, a big steel trawler, tore free from its mooring. Its engine was off, leaving it a dead, multi-ton battering ram at the mercy of the waves. It began to drift, slowly at first, and then with horrifying speed, carried by a massive swell directly toward the sea serpent. A collision was inevitable. It would be a death blow. The steel hull of the trawler would splinter the schooner's wooden frame like a matchstick. A collective gasp went through the few of us huddled on the pier. Men started shouting, pointing uselessly. Sal took a step forward, then stopped, his hands clenched at his sides. There was nothing he could do. No order he could give would stop it. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear, the shame, the years of quiet resentment. It all burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear calm. I saw not just the disaster, but the geometry of it. The wind, the current, the drift of the trawler. And I saw one chance. A slim, insane chance. There was a heavy-duty capstan winch at the end of the main pier, used for hauling the biggest vessels. It had a thick steel cable spooled around it, ending in a heavy hook. It was old, rarely used, but I knew it was still powered. Without a word, I sprinted. The wind tried to knock me off my feet, and the rain felt like needles on my face, but I didn't slow down. I could feel their eyes on me. I probably looked like a madman running into the teeth of the storm. I reached the winch and flipped the rusted cover off the power switch. I prayed. The lights flickered, and then with a low groan, the winch powered on. I grabbed the release lever, letting the heavy cable pay out into the churning water. Now, for the impossible part, I needed to get the hook onto the Northern Star. I looked back. A couple of the younger guys were just staring, paralyzed, but one of the old-timers, a man named Gus who'd been here since my grandfather's day, was already moving. He'd seen what I was doing. He met my eyes and gave a single sharp nod. He knew. He ran to a pile of spare fenders and ropes. I pointed at the piling closest to the trawler's path. He understood instantly. As the Northern Star drifted closer, I timed the swell. I swung the heavy hook and cable in a wide arc, once, twice, using my whole body. And then I let it fly. It was a throw born of 1,000 days of practice, of heaving lines and nets. The hook sailed through the air and, by some miracle, caught on the trawler's forward railing. It was a tenuous hold, but it was a hold. "Now!" I yelled, my voice raw, and Gus and two others who had joined him threw the heavy fenders over the side of the pier, creating a makeshift cushion. I slammed the winch into gear. The motor screamed in protest as it took the strain. The steel cable went taut, vibrating with a low, dangerous hum. The Northern Star, tons of dead weight, slowed its drift. It was no longer aimed at the sea serpent's heart. Instead, its trajectory was bending, pulling it parallel to the pier. It was going to hit, but it would be a glancing blow, not a fatal one. It slammed into the fenders with a deep, shuddering boom that we felt through the soles of our boots, scraped along the side of the pier for 20 yards, and then came to a groaning halt, pinned against the pilings by the tension of the winch cable. The crisis was over. The wind began to lose its edge, the shriek softening to a mournful howl. The rain eased, and in the sudden lull, the silence was deafening. I stood by the winch, my hands shaking, my lungs burning. I looked up. Everyone was staring at me. Not at the boats, not at the damage, but at me. The younger guys who'd been snickering at me that morning looked at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Their mouths were slightly open, as if they'd forgotten how to speak. Gus, the old-timer, simply touched the brim of his hat. It was the highest praise he could give. The owner of the Sea Serpent, a man in a suit that was now soaked and ruined, walked slowly toward me. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, put a hand on my shoulder, and squeezed. His eyes were filled with a gratitude so profound it was humbling. Then I saw Sal. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, water dripping from his face, looking from the secured trawler to me. The arrogance was gone. The bluster was gone. In its place was something I had never seen on his face before: utter bewilderment. He looked like a man who had just seen the world turn upside down. The natural order of things, the loud over the quiet, the new over the old, his way over my way, had been shattered in front of his eyes. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in his life, Big Sal had nothing to say. The power on the pier had shifted, not with a shout, but with a silent act. The quiet man, the joke, the relic, had just saved his harbor. If you've ever proven something to someone in silence, comment, they understood too late. The silence that fell after the storm was a strange, heavy thing. It was louder than the wind had been. The harbor, my home, looked like a war zone. Splintered wood, tangled ropes, and the sad, defeated shapes of damaged boats were everywhere. The air smelled of salt water, yes, but also of diesel fuel from a ruptured tank and the sharp green scent of freshly broken wood. But in the middle of all that chaos, the Sea Serpent sat pristine, her lines holding her as gently as a mother holding a sleeping child. She was a survivor, an island of order in a sea of destruction. No one spoke. We just stood there, a small group of soaked and shivering men, looking at the wreckage. The spell was broken when the owner of the Sea Serpent walked over to me. He was a man used to being in charge, his expensive suit now a wrinkled, salty mess. He didn't offer me money, he didn't make a big speech. He just looked me square in the eye, and I saw the storm reflected there, the fear he must have felt watching his dream being torn apart. He put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, almost lost in the dripping of the rain from the eaves of the office, but they landed with more weight than any of Sal's shouted orders ever had. He understood. It wasn't about the boat, it was about the legacy, the craftsmanship, the history she represented, and my grandfather's knot had protected it all. The other dock hands moved around me with a new kind of caution. The smirks were gone, replaced by a quiet, almost fearful respect. They'd look at me, then quickly look away, as if they were embarrassed. They were seeing me for the first time, not as the quiet joke, but as someone who knew something they didn't. They had trusted the radio, the routine, the authority. I had trusted the sky, the birds, and a knot tied with a dead man's hands. And I had been right. Their world of simple rules had been washed away, and they didn't know what to do in this new one. A world where the quiet man held the answers. I was coiling a spare line, my hands moving on their own, when a shadow fell over me. It was Sal. I didn't look up, just kept working the rope, the familiar motion a comfort in the aftermath. He stood there for a long time, saying nothing. I could feel the struggle in his silence. This was a man whose entire identity was built on being the loudest, the strongest, the one with all the answers. The storm had stripped him bare. He cleared his throat. It was a rough, uncertain sound. "That knot," he said, his voice low, stripped of its usual boom. He wasn't looking at me, but at my hands, at the rope I was coiling. My father, he used to tie something like that. Never had the patience for it myself. He finally lifted his gaze and met mine. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no apology either, not in words. An apology would have been too easy for him, and probably wouldn't have been honest. Instead, there was something far more valuable, a question. It was the look of a man who has just realized the map he's been using his whole life is wrong. "Tomorrow," he said, the words feeling heavy and strange in his mouth. "Show me how you tie it." I just nodded once. In that moment, the power dynamic of Gloucester Harbor shifted forever. He wasn't giving an order, he was asking for help. He was admitting, in the only way he knew how, that the old ways, the ways he had mocked and dismissed, had something to teach him. That was a bigger victory than any "I'm sorry" could ever be. It was respect, earned in the teeth of a hurricane. In the days that followed, the harbor slowly came back to life, but it was different. The noise was still there. The engines, the winches, the gulls. But the human noise had changed. The easy arrogance was gone, replaced by a more thoughtful quiet. When I spoke, people listened. It wasn't that I started talking more, but my few words suddenly had weight. A young deckhand would ask me, "Riley, you think this line is good for the South Cleet?" Sal himself, when a new yacht came in, would walk over and say, "What do you think, Riley? Double up on the bow?" He never mentioned the storm again, but he didn't have to. It was there in every question he asked me. The sea has a way of teaching you humility. It doesn't care how much money you have, how loud you shout, or what the forecast on the radio says. It's an ancient, powerful thing, and it only respects preparation, knowledge, and a quiet understanding of its moods. On the water, it's not the man who talks the loudest who matters. It's the one who sees the storm coming when everyone else sees a sunny day. It's the one who acts when everyone else is frozen in fear. Strength isn't about the size of your voice. It's about the reliability of your hands when the waves are crashing over the rails. My grandfather knew that. He taught me that the most important work is done in the quiet moments, long before the chaos begins. I became a different person on that pier, not because I changed, but because everyone else's perception of me did. The respect was real. I could feel it. But sometimes, late at night, when the harbor is quiet and the only sound is the gentle slap of water against the pilings, I wonder. I ask myself, do they really see me for who I am now? Do they remember me for what I did? Or do they only respect me because for one terrifying afternoon they desperately needed me? Read this ending and comment with one word that summarizes you when people doubted you.